All right, we begin a new study this morning of the book of Proverbs. We could spend most of our time just talking about the book of Proverbs. We're going to talk about some introductory information, but we're not going to spend all of our time there. We can't. We've got to cover chapters 1 and 2 as best we can. This is a book that is setting in the wisdom literature, which means overall it deals with practical daily living, as we see with other wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Psalms, etc. It is in the poetic section of the Old Testament, which means it is written in Hebrew poetry. And so we'll talk more about that as we go along, particularly beginning in chapter 10. So let's cover some introductory things about the book. Let's go to question number 1 for today. Define proverb. What does the word proverb mean? All right, it's an expression of truth about human behavior. Anything else? All right, it's a comparative way of teaching, a short saying, a short wording of biblical truth. The word literally means 4 words. F-O-R, not F-O-U-R, 4 words. In other words, it's a saying that stands for more words. In other words, it is a short statement expressing a wealth of truth. You could expand upon that short saying with the meaning and application of that, but it's all expressed in a short statement. It is a proverb. It's axiomatic, means it's not disputable. The Proverbs does not argue its case. For example, and we'll give this in another point in the next station here in just a moment, Proverbs 22:6, train a child in the way that should go, and when he's old, and not depart from it. The text doesn't argue that. This is why that's true. Here's 3 reasons why that's true. No, doesn't argue. Just states it. It's accepted. It's a fact. We see that all through the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs are general statements to which there may be exceptions. They're not absolute truths. You say, but if it's a revelation of God, it is absolute truth. No. Proverbs 22:6 is a classic. Train a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old, and not depart from it. Train a child right, he'll go right. Is there ever an exception to that? Sure. If man is not a free moral agent, man has no choice. So, it's a general statement to which there may be exceptions, but generally this is true. And we're going to see that as we go along. Now, there are many modern-day proverbs that make a wealth of information in a short statement. We won't go through all these. But, for example, don't catch your chickens before they hatch. Now, we can explain what that means, but everybody understands that. That's a stated fact. A bird in the hand's worth 2 in the bush, or the early bird gets the worm, or look before you leap. Those are modern day proverbs that say a wealth of information in a short statement. That's what a proverb is. Let's go to question number 2. Who wrote Proverbs? Solomon. Is he the only one? Who else may have written some of these proverbs? Agur? Lemuel? Mentioned in chapter 30 and 31. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about the title of the book. The word Proverbs is taken from verse 1 of chapter 1. That title is used in the Septuagint and in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Hebrew text. At one time, this book was called the Book of Wisdom or All Excellent Wisdom. So that's a little of the title. The author is not the work of one man. Solomon wrote more than any other of the Proverbs. He wrote 3,000 Proverbs according to 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 32. Chapter 10 and verse 1 through 22 and 6 is ascribed to him, and 25 to 29, chapters 25 to 29. But there are other sections. For example, 30 and verse 1, Agur and also Lemuel are mentioned as authors. Some think those are alternate names for Solomon. There seems to be no evidence of that, but I take them to be other men. Let's talk about the contents of the book. Particularly in chapters 1 through 9, wisdom is personified as a woman. that is crying out to come and eat of my feast. And so she's going to be put in contrast to the immoral woman calling you for fleshly desires. But here is a pure woman who is calling you, I've prepared a feast for you. And come and eat of my feast. And enjoy the feast that I have for you. I have wisdom to offer you. And so the contents has to do with words to live by, practical sayings from wisdom of how to live and how to be wise and how to have good common sense. We'll see more about that in chapter 1. Chapter 1 verse 8 shows that it's an appeal to those who are young and impressionable. More about that a little bit later. And then there are just multiple subjects that we don't have time to enumerate. I have a whole list of them on a separate page that I won't even get to. The tongue is dealt with. Business dealings are dealt with. Friends, raising children. There's a lot of contrast between wisdom and foolishness and righteousness and godliness and rich and versus poor, etc. Those kind of contrasts are found throughout the book. Now, there are various types of Proverbs. We're going to list three. There's contrast of Proverbs where there is one thing put in contrast to the other. Let's get a case in point. Let's look at chapter 11 and in verse 4. 11 in verse 4 said, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So there are Proverbs that show a contrast. There are Proverbs. Let's go to the 16th division of Proverbs to get this next 2 points. There are Proverbs that are completive, meaning the second line agrees with the first, like in chapter 16 and 3. Commit your ways to the Lord and your thoughts establish, and your thoughts will be established. It's just a complement and continues the same thought. Drop down to verse 8. There is comparative, where something is compared to something else. Better is little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. We'll get to all of those as we go further. Questions or comments on some introductory information? Let's go to question 3. Let's hold question 3. I want to come back to that. I want to do something else first. I want us to look at the overall picture of the book, then we'll come to question 3. This is a simplistic outline of the book of Proverbs. We're going to give more details of an outline later. Not today, but particularly when we get to chapter 10 and break some things down. And probably will before then. Chapters 1 to 9 and then 10 to 31. But anyway, chapters 1 through 9 pictures wisdom. So when you read chapters 1 to 9, if you've never studied it before, and there's nobody in here I think who hadn't read it before, but if this were your first reading of Proverbs, you read through chapters 1 to 9 and you say, okay, this is pretty simple because it takes a subject matter like any other book, like any of the epistles, and it develops that subject, and here's a block of verses that make this point, and here's a block of verses that make that point, and then suddenly you're thrown for a loop in chapter 10. Because it's just like a collection of verses. So what chapters 1 to 9 is talks about wisdom, its value, its importance, and what it does. Chapters 1 to 9. And then here's various Proverbs 10 to 31. So you come to a chapter, let's take Proverbs 12, chapter 12, chapter 16, any of those chapters. And you read it and you say, there's no single subject here, and you're right. It's just like a bucket of verses have been poured out. Those are not that hard to outline and make sense of, and we'll do that when we get into chapter 10. All right, let's go to chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about this. It's about what wisdom will and will not do. And as a subtitle of that, who seeks wisdom? The person who would follow after wisdom. The fool doesn't, but the person who fears God is a person who seeks after wisdom. Now let's go to question 3. I said we'd come back, so let's go to question 3. Proverbs 1, 1 to 7 is about the object or objective or purpose of the book. List some things you'd learn that the writer seeks to accomplish here. No wisdom and instruction. What else? Teach us how to live a disciplined life. What else? Yeah, to use knowledge and discretion. That's good. Anything else? All right, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now, here's what we see in Proverbs 1. Here's the object of the book. Then here's heeding parental instruction, avoid bad companions, and then wisdom's warning to those that will not hear. Now that's a lot to cover, but that's only one chapter. We got to get to chapter 2. So let's look at the object of the book. He said the purpose of this book is to know some things. So let's work through that. We don't have time to deal with every detail, but the purpose is to know wisdom and instruction, to know judgment. When we get through with the book, if we pay attention to the book and make application of the principles, we're going to have some judgment about us. Not only learn God's revelation, but have good judgment about us. For example, when we get to the 18th chapter, we're going to learn that there's another side to the story sometimes when there's controversy. Don't make judgments before you get all the data. Those kinds of, you're going to have good judgment. So to know wisdom for correction and have good common sense. To receive words of understanding. Look at verse 3. To receive instruction in wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. The New Century talks about being fair, honest, and right. If you want to know what's fair, if you want to know what's honest, and you want to know what's right, and you want to know what's good judgment, and you want to know what's good common sense, then listen to wisdom. Now look at verse 4. To give prudence to the simple, and to the young man knowledge and discretion. Who are the simple? Yeah. Those who are naive, those who are immature, those who are impressionable. It is not a downplay of them, but the person who is mature already has this information. The person who is not easily impressed is not going to listen to this. But this is written to impress those who need to be impressed, and those it'll give prudence to those who are simple. Now, notice at verse 5 and 6. That the wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wisdom and counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, and the words of the wise and their riddles. Now this word enigma is probably translated differently in your translation. The New King James uses this word enigma. Now it's only used one other time in the Old Testament, and it's translated a taunting in Habakkuk 2 and in verse 6. And the word gives the idea of a statement that may ridicule. Now that's interesting because it seems that the proverb is talking about we need to have an understanding of statements and delve into their meaning, even statements that may ridicule us. There are going to be some statements that are going to ridicule us, in the sense that it'll make a statement that goes against what we're doing and how we're living or how we're behaving or the bad judgment we just used. And we need to understand that enigma, that taunting, and delve into that. Make sense? That's the purpose of it. Now, verse 7. Who's going to listen to this? Ones that fear the Lord, but the fools despise wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Wisdom begins with respect for God and His words, I think is the point to be gained from verse 7. Make sense? The person who has the fear of God in their heart is the person that gains wisdom. Show me a person that you say, this person is wise. It seems like everything they say and everything they do points you in the right direction, and they just have good wisdom and they have good judgment. And I guarantee you, I'll show you somebody that has respect for God and His Word. Show me someone who has no respect for God and has no respect for His Word and has no fear of the Lord, and I'll guarantee you, I'll show you somebody that doesn't have good judgment. Does that make sense? I think that's the point of verse 7. Now let's begin at verse 8. Verse 8 through 9 talks about heeding parental instruction. And so verse 8 talks about listening to whom? Your father and your mother. Here's the first source of wisdom. Show me a teenager that's wise, and I'll show you a teenager that listened to the instructions of their parents. Show me a teenager that has rejected nearly everything the parents has had to say, and I'll show you a foolish teenager. Does that make sense? That's one of your sources of wisdom right there. But now notice at verse 9, for they will be a graceful ornament about your head and chains about your neck. What does that suggest to you? It talks about obedience. That's true. Somebody said something over here. Be proud of it. Yeah, it's you're going to look back as you get older, and you think of those of us who are well beyond our training years, that you look back at the instructions your parents gave you, and it may not have been pleasant, but you look back at that and you appreciate it, and you value that, and you honor that, and you see the wisdom of that. I can look back and there are things that I remember Mom and Dad saying, no, you can't do that. And I didn't think it was wise. But looking back now, that's pretty smart, wasn't it? They were wise. And saying, no, you can't do that. You're not going to go. That's just not. And so we look back and we see that. Now, let's begin at verse 11, or 10 rather, through verse 19. It talks about avoiding bad companions. Now, this makes an appeal to those that are young. So, let's go to question number 5. Proverbs 1:10-19 is about avoiding bad companions. List some things or points that you see about bad companions. What do you learn from this section? Yeah, don't go, don't listen. Say again? They have strong influence over you, absolutely. Now let's look and see what he says. Don't consent, verses 10 through 17. My son, this is one of our verses we talked about memorizing, a handout. If sinners entice you, do not consent. Don't listen to them. And they're going to say, come, let us lie in wait for those who shed innocent blood. Let's do what others are afraid of doing. Don't be a scaredy cat. And let us swallow them alive like Sheol. Now notice verse 13. We'll find all kind of precious possessions, fill our houses with spoil. In other words, you come and be a part of this group. You join with us, and there's a benefit to you. They're salesmen. They're selling you on this. Don't be a chicken. Don't. Say again. Yeah. What was I saying? Don't be a chicken. That's what I was saying. It's saying don't be a chicken, but then there's benefit. They're selling you on that. They're selling you on the idea that there's benefit if you do this. They come and you're going to be able to partake of these possessions. And then notice it, verse 14, cast your lot among us. Lot among us. Let us have one purse. Be one of the crowd. Does that make sense? Verse 15, don't walk in the way with them. Now, when we get to verse 17, this is quite interesting, and this is some controversy over the verse. Surely in vain a net is spread in the sight of any bird. It's the idea of trying to trap a bird, and you spread the net. Some commentators think that it's talking about the bird pays no attention to the net and flies right into it. And so the fool just pays no attention and flies right into it too. I think really what the text is saying is the bird sees the danger and he avoids it, and he's using more sense than the fool. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. The bird's sitting here watching, and you're spreading the net that's not camouflaged, it's not hidden, and you spread it in the presence of the bird. He's going to fly around it, he's going to fly over it, he's going to fly wherever, and he's going to avoid the net. Use the wisdom the bird has. Now notice the contrast, verse 18 and 19. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. In other words, the fool that goes with the bad companions, even though he sees the danger, flies right into the danger. Does that make sense? He ain't got the sense of a bird. Anybody ever accuse you of having a bird brain? Meaning you got very little brain? Sometimes the bird has more sense in that little brain than we do in ours. I think that's the point. That we see the danger, we see the problem, and yet we fly right into the net. But the bird's got more sense than that. Make sense? Maybe it's not so bad to have a bird brain at times. Now let's go to 20 to 33. This is wisdom's warning to those who will not hear. This is where wisdom begins to be personified as this woman. The wisdom calls aloud outside, and she raises her voice in the open square. Wisdom is not literally a person, but again, taking wisdom and personifying wisdom, she's standing out in the open square and she's crying out, why won't anybody listen to me? So let's look at verses 20 to 25. What does she say in 20 to 25? Look at verse 22. How long, you simple ones? Your footnote will say naive. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity, naivete? How long are you going to be naive? How long are you going to be in your ignorance? I'm offering you wisdom. I'm inviting you to my feast, and you don't come. How long is this going to go on? So she laments their failure to listen. You turned at my reproof. In other words, you turned away. I invited you to come to wisdom. You disdained my counsel, verse 25. I called you and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one regarded. I was standing out in the streets begging you, would you come to my feast? Would you come and listen to my wisdom? Would you come? And you turned your back and you walked away. How long is this going to go on? Beginning at verse 26. She announces the destruction of those who don't listen to her wisdom. You might take note of some words here, might underline them beginning at verse 26. I will laugh at there's the calamity. Underline calamity. I will mock your terror. Terror is coming. Look at verse 27. And your destruction comes. When distress and anguish. So there is destruction and problems coming because they don't listen. Now look at verse 29, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Do you see a connection with verse 7? They hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord. If you choose the fear of the Lord, you'll choose wisdom and knowledge. They go together. They can't separate them. You can't burst them apart. They just don't come apart. Absolutely. Verse 31 is making the point that you reap what you sow. When you don't listen to wisdom, you're going to reap what you sow. They shall eat the fruit of their own way. That's another way of saying they reap what they sow. You don't listen to wisdom, you're going to reap what you sow. You're going to pay the consequence. Now, look at verse 32. For the turning away of the simple will slay them. Here's another word you underline, and destroy them. So, destruction is coming. I mean, this is bad. This is not like you don't listen to wisdom, you're just going to be unwise and you're never going to be sought out for counsel. You don't listen to wisdom, you're headed for destruction. It's going to bring your ruin. It's going to destroy your life. What it's going to do. We're going to see evidence of that in chapters 5, 6, and 7, by the way. It's going to absolutely ruin your life. Now, verse 33. What does verse 33 say? Yeah, those who listen, there is safety. Whoever listens to me will dwell safely and be secure and without fear of evil. I'm crying out, if you just come and listen to me, you're going to be safe. You come and listen to me, you're going to be secure. If you don't, you're headed for trouble. Make sense? What wisdom will and will not do. It'll heed parental instruction. It'll avoid bad companions. It's going to listen to wisdom, and it's going to listen to good advice. And those who don't are headed for calamity. Absolutely. Questions, comments? Proverbs 1.
There's so much truth. I mean, in today's world, we've got what's going on and things that are falling apart. If we have the wisdom that we're not discouraged because we know God is still going to reward us for being right. Just that wisdom makes us live an easier and peaceful life.
Absolutely. Question number 8 needs to be corrected. Wisdom helps us walk, that should be, in what? And that should be Proverbs 2, verses 20 through 22. And you tell me what the answer is.
Walk in the way of goodness, the way of life, the way of protection, the path of righteousness.
Absolutely, in the right path. All right, let's go to Proverbs 2. Wisdom must be sought. We're going to develop a theme through this. Give you a case in point. Proverbs 1, will and will not do. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm not sold on a product, I'm standing at the store and the salesman is trying to sell me on this tool. I'm not ready to bite yet. The first thing he's going to have to convince me of is not just the price, but what it'll do for me. The value of it. Does that make sense? Tell me what it will and will not do. And now I'm sold. Chapter 1. Chapter 2, you're going to have to go after it. Chapter 3, here's the value of wisdom, more about what it will do. Chapter 4 is going to talk about wisdom is the principal thing. It's not just something that's good, it's the principal thing. And then we'll see some evidence of what it'll do in chapters 5, 6, and 7. All right, so here's what wisdom must be sought. Wisdom must be diligently sought, verses 1 to 9. So let's make our way through verses 1 to 5 to start with. He said, look at verse, let's see here, in verses 1 to 5. I don't have that broke down in points 1 and 2 under A, but here's what I would do if I did that. Verses 1 and 2 talk about be receptive and see the value of wisdom. If you receive my words and treasure my commands, you see their value, so that you incline your ear and apply your heart to understanding. So you must seek it, verses 1 to 5, must be receptive to wisdom. And see the value of it that had just been described in chapter 1. When I see there's value in parental instruction, divine revelation, good judgment, when I see value of it, I'm going to be receptive to it. Now, verses 3 to 5, I would subdivide that to say you've got to work for it and search it out and seek it. Notice at verse 3, if you cry out for discernment, what does that mean? Beg for it. Maybe this is not the best illustration, but if you saw me out in the yard and I'm not saying a word, I'm not even walking, not looking, you say, what are you doing? I'm looking for my dog that's lost. If I'm really earnest about it, I'm going to be looking around, walking, and I'm going to be hollering, crying, and shouting the name of the dog. I'm looking for you. And so go crying for wisdom like it's lost, like you're looking and it's about to get away from you. And so I'm looking for wisdom. Where is wisdom? Come, wisdom. Make sense? You cry for it, number one. Number two, notice, if you seek her as for silver, as for hidden treasures. Like it's precious, number one, and you go digging for it and mining for it. Wisdom is not always easily found. Does that make sense? In other words, wisdom is not just delivered at your door and all of a sudden, well, I've just got an abundance of wisdom and I'm just as wise as anybody. Those with wisdom went looking for it and they searched for it and they dug it out. They found it in the revelation. They sought it out from wise people, etc. Make sense? They turned to the revelation of God, etc. Seek for as for wisdom, and then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So you got to seek it. Got to dig for it. Got to mine for it. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Look at verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. That's a powerful verse. Why is that so powerful? It told me the source of my wisdom is God. I want to be wise. I want to be wise. So I need to go sit at the feet of ungodly men at a university so I can be wise. Right? That's not the source. I'm going to turn to God's revelation and those who feed off of God's revelation. In other words, show me somebody that has lived a life of years and years of following the revelation of God, and they're going to give me some advice. Do you think that might be helpful? Yeah, it might be. It might be. Because they've been listening to God. Here's the source of your wisdom. All right, begin at verse 7 through verse 9. It's going to be worth it, is his point. Now, in verses 7 to 9, there's three things. I would subdivide that up. Number one, it's going to be worth listening to God and seeking out wisdom, because what you'll have is verse 7, 7a, a storehouse of wisdom and knowledge. Now, if you need money, and I said, okay, you need money, here's a key to this warehouse. And there's just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of $100 bills. Just go get what you need. That'd be helpful? God says, here's the key to a warehouse full of knowledge and wisdom. You just got to take the key. Does it make sense? All right, here's the second thing. Verse 7b and 8. It serves as a shield to those who walk upright and guards their paths. It's a defense. You see, it's going to be worth it to seek wisdom, because not only do you have excess, you have the key to the storehouse of knowledge and wisdom, but you have a defense. You say, what do you mean defense? He's about to tell us before we get through with the chapter. And then verse 9, that you will understand righteousness and justice. In other words, you'll know what's right, and you'll have good common sense, and you'll have good judgment. Make sense? It's going to be worth it. You say, but it takes a lot of work. It's kind of like mining gold. And you dig 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 and get a lot, and finally you get a little bit. But if you really dig, it's going to finally pay off. It's going to be worth it. And the same thing, you have to search after wisdom, and you have to dig for it, and you have to work for it, and it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. Make sense? All right. Now, it's going to safeguard us against two areas. And so let's go to question number 7. Chapter 2 is about seeking wisdom, and it must be sought, and we must seek wisdom as a safeguard against what? (15) and 16 to 19 against seductress, the loose woman. All right, let's get what that's all about here. I want to quickly notice the evil men, because I want to get and have time to deal with the loose woman, because we need to tie her with chapters 5, 6, and 7. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, starting at verse 10. When wisdom enters your heart, knowledge is pleasant to your soul. 'An evil companion and evil people, listening to wisdom will steer you from them. This footnote. Show me somebody says, you know what? I've been around the block and I've got wisdom, and they are constant companions with evil people. What's your reaction to that? I've got wisdom. I've been around the block a few times. I have some wisdom, and I've read my Bible, probably more than you have, and I've got wisdom, but they're constant companions among evil people. Why do you say they're not wise, Steve?
One word tells us, and you go ahead, fast forward in time, and see the consequences.
It ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna be good. So the point is, and Stephen is exactly right, that the person with wisdom is delivered. Wisdom says, no, stay away from them. Stay away from them. And we're not through with that concept. We saw it earlier, we see it again, and we're not through with that. The Proverbs is going to hit it again and again and again and again and again on down the line. These are people, verse 14, who rejoice in doing evil. They delight in perversity of the wicked, and their ways are crooked. And so what wisdom will do will steer you from them. If you're headed toward them, you're not listening to wisdom. If you listen to wisdom, you're going to go in the opposite direction. It's going to steer you from the loose woman. This would apply to the woman as toward a loose man, but this is talking about a seductress here. Now, let's get the point here, and then I want to come back in the last minute or two and see if we can make some application of verse 17. First of all, I'll learn something about how she operates and her methods. Look at verse 16. To deliver you from the loose woman and the seductress who flatters. We're not through with that. He's going to get to that in chapters 5, 6, and 7. One of the tools, wisdom not only tells you stay away from adultery, fornication, but warns, here's what leads to that. But pay close attention. She's flattering you. She's telling you how good you look. She's telling you you're the only one. She's flattering you and buttering you up, and she's trying to get you ready for the kill. Don't listen to that flatter. Don't listen to it. Now, we're not through with that. It's going to come a little bit later. Look at verse 18. Let's get ahead. The consequences of this, wisdom says that if I heed this seductress and pay attention to her, that's going to lead to death. There's devastation and destruction that comes because of that. We're not through with that. Chapters 5, 6, and 7. All right? She forsakes the companion of her youth. I want to say more about that in a moment, but here's one of the lessons. She's supposed to be married, and she was unfaithful to her husband, and you're thinking about getting tied up with her, maybe marrying her. Guess what's about to happen in time? She's going to be unfaithful to you too. You can't trust her. So don't think she's going to be loyal to you. She wasn't loyal to her first husband. She's a seductress. So stay clear of her path. And so she's one who forgets about God. Now I want to come back to that. I want to quickly hit this because I'm about to leave this outline. In verses 20 to 25, wisdom has to be sought to walk in the right path. So I just want to quickly hit that so that you may walk in the way of goodness and keep in the right paths for the upright dwell in the land, etc. So why do I need to seek wisdom? Is a safeguard against evil and to keep me on the right path. Does that make sense? Now let's go to verse 17. I can't spend any time with Proverbs 2 and not talk about verse 17. Countless have been the times that I've talked to somebody who's had an affair. A Christian I'm talking about. A Christian who's had an affair. And usually in the heated moment of this being discovered that they've had an affair, they make the statement, almost always they make a statement, I don't know how this happened. I don't know. And then I will proceed, well, the Bible tells us, but they're not listening. And I will suggest Proverbs 2, and their reaction to that generally is, no, that's not it. Okay. Within 3 months, almost always, that person comes back to me and said, you were right. And that's not because of my wisdom. That's because God said it all along. And so God was right. I knew that was right because it's what God had told me. And so here's what happened in that case. When here is a Christian, supposed to be a Christian, who is married and they have an affair, this text tells me two things that lead to adultery. She forsakes the companion of her youth. She's supposed to be married, but she violated the marriage vow, which means the marriage had deteriorated. Almost always the person will tell me, but our marriage was great. I don't understand. No, it wasn't great. It wouldn't have happened if it was great. This is stupid. It wasn't great. The marriage deteriorated. The second thing is, she forgets the companion of her youth. Her faith got weaker. If your faith is strong and your marriage is strong, there's not going to be an affair. Those two things have to happen. So if your faith starts getting weaker and your marriage is crumbling, guess what? You are in danger. You're in danger. Now, I don't have time to develop this because this is a sermon within itself, but here's kind of things that happen. Faith starts getting weaker because we have little time for the spiritual. I get busy in my business life or whatever it may be. I'm not studying as much as I should. I'm not praying as much as I should. Almost every man who has committed adultery has told me I'm not studying like I used to. I don't pray like I used to. And consequently, that means material things have a greater attraction. They don't fear God as much as they should. Spirituality is not priority. They're not bothered by sin. It's easier to do things that you know wrong because your faith is getting weaker. That usually happens gradually. Then the second thing is marriage deteriorates. Maybe we don't spend time with each other. We're not communicating as we should. That happens gradually. And so gradually we're pulling apart and marriage is deteriorating. And consequently, Our commitment to our mate means less. We focus on ourselves. We're at a great risk when someone of the opposite sex shows you attention and flirts. We're not bothered by that flirting. And then, big surprise, adultery has been committed. Because of two reasons. What are they? She forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. Faith gets weaker and marriage deteriorates. Does that make sense? And if we don't get anything else from Proverbs 2:17, we get that. You say, I notice my faith getting weaker. You better build your faith. I notice the marriage is kind of pulling. It's not what it used to be. You better be working on that. Because if you let your faith get weaker and your marriage deteriorate, you are a prime candidate. Doesn't mean you have committed adultery. Doesn't mean that you are, but you're a prime candidate for that. When your marriage is strong and your faith is strong, it's not going to happen. Because it never, ever happens to people with strong faith and strong marriages. It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. We'll stop on that note.